ever done something to try to get someone to like you? Like maybe you pretended you were totally into Lizzo so that girl that you were crushing on would be impressed. But then when she asked you about your favorite song and you absolutely had nothing to contribute to the conversation, it became obvious that you were acting. Or maybe you were trying to get a friend group to like you, so you started dressing a certain way, talking a certain way, but it wasn't because that was who you really were. It was so this group would approve of you and let you be a part. See, when I was younger, I did something pretty crazy to gain approval of some of my friends. See, when I was younger, I didn't hang out with the best crowd. Actually, that's quite an understatement. We were really bad kids. Anyways, I robbed somebody to show them that I was down. And I guess I was. And I stole a car to prove to them that I was with it. And it cost me a lot in the long run. We all want to do everything we can to look as good as possible so that people around us will accept us. And maybe it sounds crazy, but we're all doing it. In some ways, high school feels like 5% academics, 5% social life, and 90% trying to get other people to like us. We all do it. And spoiler alert, it isn't amazing, and it's not something that necessarily goes away when you're an adult. I can totally relate to the feeling of wanting to look cool in front of the right group of people. It's why we dress the way we do, talk the way we do, and listen to the things that we do.
In some ways, sometimes high school feels like it's 5% academics, 5% social life, and 90% trying to get other people to like us. We all do it. And spoiler alert, this isn't something that necessarily goes away when you become an adult. I can totally relate to the feeling of wanting to look cool in front of the right group of people. It's why we dress the way we do, or talk the way we do, and listen to the things we do. It's kind of like we all have one of these, an applause meter. It's like we all have a mental scoring system, and we're always trying to guess how the other person is ranking us. Is it yay or womp womp? We all know that feeling, and we all know how exhausting it is. Working to get people to like you is a full-time job, people, and no matter how good we are at it, we never feel completely satisfied with what we've accomplished. And usually at the end of the day, we feel tired. But even more than being exhausting, it's the feeling that no matter what, it won't be enough. There will always be that group of people, that coach, that teacher, or even that parent whose approval will feel just out of reach.
So we're gonna go back to the book of Galatians today, where we started last week, to look at this letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the people of Galatia. There was tension with the church because Paul had been there and taught them, but after he left, other teachers came in and they were teaching something a little different. Paul's message was, Jesus saved you. You are free from the pressure of keeping the law to be right with God. And these other guys came around saying, not so fast. Actually, you kind of have to keep these Jewish commands too for the whole salvation thing to work. This made Paul very upset, which makes sense. Do you remember when you were little and you would work for hours to create something? Maybe it was a Lego tower or a drawing or a puzzle, and then a younger sibling came by with one move and destroyed everything you'd been working so hard on. That is the feeling that Paul had when he heard what the other teachers were saying. He was mad because they had ruined the teaching he had given those people in Galatia, and the teachings that had come straight from Jesus himself. Paul had to make a decision. Did he care more about getting people to like him, or did he want people to know beyond a shadow of a doubt what Jesus came to do, which is set us free? Thinking we had to earn God's approval? That's not what Jesus came for. So Paul decided to write to the Galatians in this letter, and he opened it by saying this: I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. Those are some pretty blunt words. And Paul continues, and he says this: obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. Paul is basically saying, I'm probably gonna make you mad with what I say here, but I wanna set the record straight, and I'm not here for your approval. The truth is, Paul didn't exactly need more enemies. He had plenty. He was on the run for his life throughout most of the New Testament. The Roman government was out to get him, but so were the Jewish religious leaders. If anyone had an excuse to work for the approval of people, it was Paul. He could have used some backup and some cheerleaders. But Paul wasn't interested in building a team. He was interested in making sure that the message of Jesus got out as many people as possible. So Paul wrote those words at the very start of his letter to the Galatians because he wanted to make sure it was clear what his intent was. So let's go back and look again. Obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If people pleasing was my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. There's no getting around it. Paul was more concerned with God and what he had to say than what the people had to say. Maybe you hear that at first and think it sounds kind of harsh, but Paul didn't see that as a pass to be a jerk. In fact, he's going after God's approval, not the approval of people. Paul's harshness towards those other teachers in Galatia was because they were shrinking God down to misinterpreting what God was like. Paul was saying, God's better than that, and I'm not going to stand here while you make God into something that he isn't. So if anything's going to go after the approval, I'm going to go after the approval of God, not the respect of others. In fact, in this very next verse, Paul addresses the church in Galatia as brothers and sisters, meaning he obviously cared about his relationship with them. Paul said what he said because he cares about the church and the people in that church, and more than what they thought about him. Paul cared about what God thought. So, at a risk of hurting feelings of others and others' teachers, Paul told the truth about what God was like. Paul was basically saying there is no difference between caring about something and being controlled by it. He cared about the people who made the Galatian church. He cared about the influence he had in their lives. He cared about having influence with them, but he was not controlled by their need of approval. And that small difference is what kept him from being controlled by whether or not they approved of him. Because Paul knew what he really wanted, and what the people of Galatia really wanted was freedom. And freedom can never be found in waiting for all the right people to approve of you. Because of God, we're free to make God's approval our first priority in life, no matter the circumstance. Of course, that sounds easier than it actually is to live out. So for the next few minutes, we are going to get really specific about what it looks like to be controlled by the approval of others instead of the approval of God. And remember, living for the approval of others isn't just about what we do, it's about what motivates us to do what we do. Both matter. If you're willing to say things about other people or do things with other people that you wouldn't if you were alone, or that goes against a voice in the back of your mind that tells you you should stop talking, stop doing, stop laughing, you may be controlled by the approval of others. If the emotions of your whole day or week are determined by how one coach or one teacher or a group of friends responds to what you say or how you play or how often you perform on a test, and it changes how you feel about yourself, you might be controlled by the approval of others. If you find yourself more judgmental of others and less accepting, and if you find yourself feeling like you're better than certain people, you may care about the approval of others than what God thinks, because God is not that way. This matters for a couple of reasons. Living for the approval of others eventually starts to control you, and being controlled is the opposite of freedom. That's not what God wants for you. But even more than that, living for the approval of others is a miserable way to live. It's like being caught on a hamster wheel that you can never get off of. God's better than that. Here, we need to remember God has loved and accepted us no matter what. We have to work for that? No, we don't have to work for that approval. We are accepted. We are loved. We are cared about by God. And that doesn't change based on how we live. God doesn't change the way he sees us. Ever. Ever, ever, ever. But if you are doing something that hurts yourself, hurts someone else, or hurts a relationship, God doesn't approve, because God knows that's not best for you or who God wants you to be. So, when we know we are already accepted, working for God's approval is a lot easier because it's not a burden. We do it in freedom, knowing God's thoughts about us don't change. The problem with living for the approval of others is the approval and acceptance that we feel can feel the same, but people around us will change. And that can put us down, and that's no way to live. Knowing we are already accepted makes living for God's approval something that we get to do and not a burden that makes us feel fearful God will stop loving us. So, what does living for God's approval look like? Well, Paul tells us. Pay careful attention to your own work, for then you will get the satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to anyone else, for we are each responsible for our own conduct. Living for God's approval means you are freely accepted, and in your freedom, you should live in a way that honors God. Paul doesn't mean to not care about others, and he doesn't mean God's approval changes how God already sees you. Paul means that you are living with one person's approval in mind, and that's God. God already accepted you. Now, working for God's approval is all that matters, and if we lose sight of that, we will be exhausted and insecure in our work to get other people to give us the approval that we're seeking from God. You don't need others to give you what God has already given you. You don't need their approval because the God who made you already accepts you. God's feelings for you don't change, so God's approval is the only one that will ever matter.